spirits languish, terrified to draw too near. May we know each other's anguish, and with love that casts out fear, bind all our wounds again.
Thank you, Aaron. Good morning, everybody. My name is Rick Honnenberg, and I serve as president of the Board of Trustees of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Spartanburg this year. Thank you again for joining us via live stream this morning. In cooperation with global and national health authorities, we have suspended all in-person church activities for the time being. Our care for one another and for our community only becomes more important in times like these. Our ministry is expanding with many ways we can help one another, comfort one another, and grow together even though we are physically apart. I encourage you to visit our website, www.uucs.org, for ways you can join in our work. If you have any questions or concerns, please do not hesitate to contact me, any of our board members, or any of our members on our staff. Our job is to serve you. Now, we are glad that you have taken the time to connect with us this morning, especially in times like this. We need each other. I just wanted to make a quick announcement. I know I've had some calls on our scheduled mountain retreat on May 29th, 30th, and 31st. Right now, we're kind of deciding what to do, and Scott and Sybil are trying to be talking with the mountain folks. And we will, as soon as we know a firm plan, we'll get back and announce it as soon as we possibly can. And I want to thank you folks for being on our congregation today. We are all people of faith and hope. Welcome and stay safe.
Good morning. I want to thank you all for joining us this morning through this live stream and for choosing to be together as a congregation, even though we are so far apart physically. The affirmation and support that we have received as we have pursued these services has been very, very helpful. The constructive criticism and the words of praise, the sharing of the service with others who might find them of meaning. We know that our last services have been viewed not only by many people in our own community, but by many people across our nation, across many states. Thank you for connecting us as a people, even when we cannot be together. For those of you who are members of this congregation, I want to encourage you to visit our Facebook page, the closed Facebook page that is only for those who are members of this congregation, so that we can share the life of the congregation and its intimacy with one another. Yesterday, two of our members, Mitch and Palma Eisner, posted a short 6-minute video that they made in their own home. Mitch and Palma are longtime members of our congregation, faithful UUs, and leaders in many of the aspects of our life together, and they are also faithful Jews. This week is Passover, and Mitch and Palma have made a short video explaining the traditions of Passover and what they mean to their family and to Jews around the world. And I want to urge you to watch this video. It's beautifully done, and it is perfect for Passover. It is liberating, it is about empowerment, and it comes from the heart of their home, where the Passover rituals are celebrated, in family, in the home community, for the benefit of the world. This year in April, Passover and Easter and Ramadan all take place or begin in the month of April. And so this month, we will celebrate the prophetic tradition that each of those monotheisms, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are a part of. The heart of Judaism and Christianity and Islam, and also the very best of Western political and philosophical thought, is not, first of all, about beliefs or systems or theisms. Rather, these traditions are a summons to conscience and community. Prophets and prophetic communities are not future tellers. They read the political and economic and spiritual signs of their age to summon their societies to care for their most vulnerable members. Care for our most vulnerable members is the core work and highest ideal of every society. And although we may not share the same beliefs or rituals or practices, Unitarian Universalists are inheritors of this prophetic tradition, to speak truth, to grieve and loss, and to offer hope. The question we are asking this month is, how can we be prophets? How can we be a prophetic community? What can we do in this most extraordinary time to care for the most vulnerable members of our society? I want to urge you to visit our website, uucs.org, to click on the Help button. There you will find listed many actions you can take to be of service in this time, actions of compassion and mercy, of giving and of advocacy. But further, we want to ask one another to think, what can I do to care for the people around me, especially the people who are most vulnerable to me, the people over whom I have some power? One example. I learned of a member of our own congregation, a person whose income comes in part through rents. They are a landlord. And before Congress could act, before legislation was passed, before interest rates dropped a second time, this person took it upon themselves to cut the rents of all who owe them for the property that they own and rent to others, to cut the amount due by half. This is an extraordinary act of mercy, a prophetic act, one of gentleness and kindness, of love and healing. Let us all do what we can to share one another's fear and suffering during this time, and thereby transform this time into something that is shared and that can be healing and that is beautiful. Thank you for being with us today.
This reading, the defiance of Shiphrah and Puah, comes from Exodus 1. Now a new king arose over Egypt, and he said, "Come, let us deal shrewdly with the Israelites." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, "When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, she shall live." But the midwives did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live.
Spirit of life, come unto me. Sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion. Blow in the wind, rise in the sea, move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. Roots hold me close, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me.
The celebration of Passover is a celebration of the exodus of the Hebrew people out of enslavement in the land of Egypt into freedom. A freedom that is bound by covenant. The people travel to Mount Sinai and enter into a covenant with their God, a covenant that governs their relationship with each other, how they will work with one another and support one another, how they will become a people who share the covenantal power of right relationship through themselves with the world. This congregation has a covenant in that same tradition. It's written by this congregation, and it speaks to us of how we will relate to one another, how we will support one another in order to be a prophetic people, sharing the power of love beyond belief with a world in need of transformation and healing. For those of you who know this covenant, I invite you to say it with me now. And for those of you who do not, I invite you to listen and to join us in your hearts with these words of beauty and power that come from the heart of this congregation. We are a people of faith and hope. Together we covenant to strive to become our better selves, to honor both the critical mind and the generous heart, to prove that diversity need not mean divisiveness, and to respond to systems of violence and oppression with the power of a love beyond belief. This is the time in our service when we gather around a rippling bowl and place a stone or a shell in the water as a sign of our joys and concerns. Joys shared are multiplied, concerns shared are lessened. At this time, I want to invite you to share with one another across distance the joys and concerns of your hearts. And in this silence, to send greeting to one another by text or by email or simply across space from your heart to others. Share with one another our joys and our concerns, even in the silence, even in the distance. We are connected. Many of you have asked how you can give to the church during this time. First, let me thank you for your astounding generosity. The gifts that we have received to support the Minister's Discretionary Fund and Total Ministries over the last weeks in immediate response to the pandemic have been unbelievable. Thank you for that outpouring of your gifts. Gifts far more than financial, all the ways that you are supporting one another and sharing with one another, connecting with one another, helping one another to navigate these, I'm sorry to say, early days of what we face. The strength of our response and interconnectedness gives me great hope for the days that lie ahead. If you want to give financially, first let me encourage you never to do so when you yourself are under strain. These are difficult times, and there is no expectation that anyone will overextend themselves when they should not. And when we have gifts we want to give, there are many ways we can do it. If you go to our website, uucs.org, and click on the Help button, you will find many ways that you can share financial gifts, both in service to community organizations, to organizations in New York at the epicenter of the pandemic in the United States, to international organizations that are addressing needs globally, and also in support of the work of this congregation, which has only expanded during this time. Let me thank you again for your generosity. Speak truth. The prophetic tasks of the church, writes Walter Brueggemann, an internationally reputed, beloved, and rightly famous scholar of the Hebrew Bible and of the prophetic tradition, a member of the UCC, United Church of Christ, an organization that has a connection with the UUA, particularly in the development and sharing of our OWL program. The prophetic tasks of the church, Brueggemann writes, are to tell the truth in a society that lives in illusion, to grieve in a society that practices denial, and to express hope in a society that lives in despair. To tell the truth in the face of illusion, to grieve in the face of denial, and to hope in the face of despair. We must care for one another, and we must continue to speak the prophetic, profound, essential truth. We must care for one another, and we must speak that truth. I was on a call this week with many members of this community, the wider community, a call that included pastors from many different congregations of every variety, liberal, conservative, non-Christian, and Christian. Many people gathered together, convened to think about how we can work together as a community during this time. It was a good and important call, and we went through many priority items, things that we can all do to help at this time. Just the basics: social distancing, food pantries that need food, ways to support our schools, all of those crucial ways that the structures of our society need to be shored up at this time so that they don't fracture, they don't fray, and people don't fall between the gaps. It was well led, well facilitated, and a lot of ground was covered in less than an hour. And one of the goals of this call, of this meeting, was precisely to find those gaps, those blind spots that we may be missing, places where help may be needed. And when the question was raised, what are we missing? What else might we need to do? In the space of silence that followed, I spoke into the call. And I said, I honestly don't know enough about this, but what I am hearing is that members of our community who may be undocumented, members of our immigrant community who are a crucial part of our labor force and on whom we as a community depend economically and socially and culturally, they may not be eligible to receive assistance under the new legislation that is passed. And I want to ask that we add to the agenda of this call when we convene again in a short time to ask the question, what is happening with these folks? What do they need? And what can we do? The response that came was not a bad response, and it was very understandable. It's the kind of response that I myself would often give in a situation like that, thinking through resources that are currently in place and what those folks can do to access these resources. It wasn't a bad answer, but it wasn't quite on point. And another voice cut across our conversation into the call, a voice that was trembling with its own power, aware of what it was saying and the difficulty of what it was saying and the necessity of what it was saying. And that voice said, people on whom our economy depends, but who do not have recognized citizenship status in our country, will not receive support from the legislation that has passed. And further, their children, who may have recognized citizenship status in our country, but whose parents do not, will also not receive support from the legislation that has just passed. My tentative words, a good answer from leaders of the conversation, but then a trembling, powerful voice cutting across the conversation to say, no, there is a deeper truth here to which we must attend. And the tone of the whole conversation changed. And the question became, how can we find out more? And what do we need to do to appropriately respond, helpfully respond to people on whom we all so depend and who are at such great risk to be left out? And then the conversation went further. It has been widely reported that ICE will no longer pursue and detain people who may be living in the country with undocumented status during this time, except in the most egregious cases, all to encourage them to seek medical attention when needed. And yet it was shared on the call that what we are hearing from people in the community is that there is such an atmosphere of fear that has been created in our country, such a sense of desperation and hiding and distrust, that the people who most need to believe those reports so that they can seek medical attention when they are sick do not trust those reports, do not believe that they will be exempt from detention and arrest, and are resolved not to seek care in this time. And this shows how the plight of those most vulnerable in our society is the plight of us all. Consider the power, not only of that one trembling voice, but of two voices combined, my tentative and the other much stronger and more self-assured, and then of the chorus of voices saying, what must we do as a society to care for those most vulnerable in our community in this time and this place? That is the prophetic tradition. Voices joining together to speak the deep truth. We must care for one another, and we cannot stop saying it because the work is never done. This has been a very frustrating week. Despite a superabundance of data and the powerful work of many journalists, despite the repeated calls, the consistent messaging of public health officials in this country and around the world, we have seen our own citizens in this state and in this city continue to ignore the directive to social distance, continue to go into locations where they should not go, to defy the request to voluntarily heed the public health call. Someone very dear to me was in the grocery store just this morning, and people were walking up to them to speak to them and trying to hand them goods off of the grocery store shelf. People are not paying attention, despite the superabundance of information that is being poured out over the most reliable media streams. And our state government, led by our state governor, has taken a slow, moderate, piecemeal approach to insisting that people follow these most basic public health directives. It's not that what has been asked is not good. It is good, but it is not what is best. And by the behavior of our own citizens, down to this morning in our own supermarkets, it is evident that the step-by-step approach is not sufficient. It is not sufficiently working. And our federal response, which has been confused and contradictory, has been characterized most of all by strong voices insisting on action and a single overpowering voice speaking over all other voices and pushing people into confusion and noncompliance. It is telling to me that in the story of Passover, the leader of a nation, the Pharaoh, constantly backpedaled on the promise to help people, constantly revised the plan to address the growing plagues on the people of Egypt, until such utter destruction had gripped the nation that there was no longer any avoiding what was happening. It seems to be that only the most conservative projections of a mortality count, if the trajectory of the pandemic in the United States does not change, only those numbers have gotten the attention of our president. And even at that, there is half-hearted support for the strongest and clearest and most cogent voices. The most prophetic and powerful voice of all from the federal government, the leading immunologist who has seen us through so many previous trials and knows what to do and knows what to tell us. That person has been so vilified and attacked on social media that in their effort to protect all of us, they now must have their own personal security detail to protect them from those that would attack them. What kind of confused messaging are we receiving? It has been a frustrating week. And for all of us who have tried to do our part, and more than our part, to take on acts of mercy and compassion, and to call our governor, and to call the White House, and to ask for clearer, stronger steps, because we can see on the ground around us that what is happening is not working. We have been met by voicemail boxes that are too full, press conferences that seem not to have heeded a word we've said, rebuke after rebuke from those who disagree with us. This has been a frustrating week. And we may feel like there's no point to any of this, that our voice doesn't count, that we're scared enough to even try, that it's just not worth it. We must care for one another, and we must speak that truth without ceasing. I want to ask us, in our frustration, to remember those who cannot quit. The healthcare workers, and the sanitation workers, and the food distribution workers, all of those people who cannot stop what they're doing, who don't have time. They don't have the luxury of time to get so frustrated that they might just stop what they're doing. They know the urgency of now. And by their actions, we see the truth. Their actions speak a truth more eloquent than any words. We must care for one another. They believe it so strongly that they are willing to walk into danger at risk to themselves to care for us. They believe so strongly that we must care for each other, that we must care for one another, that they value our lives, yours and mine, as much as their own, and are willing to risk their lives for us. That is leadership. That is understanding. And that is the prophetic tradition. We must care for one another. And we must speak the power of that truth in support of those who, by their actions, the risks that they run, and the lives that they are leading in this moment, show us the profundity and power of that truth. This week, our friends and family members, the members of our congregation, our siblings, our brothers and sisters who are Jewish, celebrate Passover. Passover is the story of the people of Israel led by a prophet, Moses, out of oppression, out of plague, out of the land of Egypt into freedom, into the formation of a new prophetic community through covenant on Mount Sinai, so that then and through time, up to the present day, that small band of people, the Hebrew people who became the people of Israel, could witness to the necessity of caring for every single person as if their life mattered as much as our own. That is the core teaching of Judaism, that every person matters equally. And that is the prophetic message proclaimed by the story of Passover, a prophetic people formed to speak that message through history and time for all the world. But the story doesn't begin with that people, and it doesn't begin with Moses. It begins with two women living in enslavement in the land of Egypt, two women with no voice at all, two midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. Think of them as two nurses devoted to their task. When the Pharaoh turns to genocide, when he becomes so enraged at his enslaved workforce, the laborers who are not doing all the work he wants them to do, and when he wants to put the cruelty of his oppression on them even more, he turns to the midwives and orders them to commit genocide, to kill every Hebrew boy who is born. When they help a Hebrew woman give birth, they are to spare the girls, but kill the boys. And these two women, with no voice, as the story says, under direct orders from the ruler of the land, refuse. They will not listen to the authoritarian voice, but instead follow the voice of conscience. They save every child, boy and girl. Imagine the risk that those two women ran. Imagine receiving a direct order from the leader of the land and defying it because the voice of conscience was stronger in your head than the voice of domination. And in the story, these women are called to account. They have to answer to the Pharaoh who asked them what in the world they are doing. Consider the risk that these women ran. Their lives witness to the fundamental truth. We must care for every person. They knew the danger to themselves, and they were willing to risk their own lives to save the lives of every person they could. When Moses is called to be a prophet, to lead the people, he is terrified to speak. He doesn't think he can do it. And it is the example of Shiphrah and Puah, those women who came before him, who show him that even those without a voice can speak, and that our actions are far more eloquent than our words. By their example, Moses steps into his calling, and the people of Israel into theirs. To proclaim the prophetic truth down to this day, we must care for one another. A prophet is just a person who has read the economic and political and spiritual signs of their society and who speak the truth in their words and most of all in their actions. We must care for one another. We have a problem. We have a problem in our nation and in our state. We are governed by a political philosophy of personal responsibility. Now, there is nothing wrong with personal responsibility. I think that personal responsibility is absolutely essential. And in fact, one way to understand this entire meditation is that I'm arguing we all take personal responsibility to step into the prophetic role. But as a governing political philosophy, personal responsibility is only half right. It is right, and it is good. It is essential. It protects us all. And I highly value the freedoms for which it argues and that it preserves. I'm not against this political philosophy. And as many of you know in the conversations that we've had, even the most conservative and also libertarian manifestations of this political philosophy, I think, have an important place in our democracy. They offer a very important perspective and very important view and very important protections. The philosophy of radical personal responsibility is good and incomplete. It is half of what we need because we are not only individuals, and many of us are often not responsible. And in a situation like this, when all of the data and all of the science and all of the public health leaders are telling us that a more uniform, national, communitarian approach is needed, there is another half of our political philosophy that is also needed. The half measure of personal responsibility is incomplete in itself. Yes, we need it. And no, it is not sufficiently working. Half measures, organized by half philosophies, do not serve a whole community. This week, our city council gathered. I have great respect for everyone on our city council, and am quite close to some of its members. And that city council issued a resolution supporting the good work that our state government has done, urging our citizens to social distance, and insisting that we follow the most helpful guidelines issued by public health authorities. This is very good, but it is not enough. And in that meeting, 2 women, let's call them Shifra and Pua, spoke. They agreed that the measures that City Council would adopt, and for which they also voted, were important measures. They were not wrong. But they argued clearly and cogently and prophetically and with grief that the behavior of our fellow citizens and the behavior of our leaders at every level of government show us this is not enough. I want for our leaders to succeed. And it is our job as citizens in a democracy and as people who have inherited the prophetic tradition and as people who owe our well-being to the prophetic actions of healthcare workers and sanitation workers and food distributions in this country and around the world. It is our job to keep speaking the truth. If you go to our website, uucs.org, and click on the help button. I know I keep saying it, but the rule of thumb in churches is that you have to say something 7 times before anybody listens. And so I'm going to keep saying it. If you will click on the button, you will find advocacy steps that you can take for our state and national leaders, urging them to take a national, cooperative approach in service to us all. I want you to hear me on this. I'm not interested in getting in big fights and arguments. That's not who I am, and I don't know that that often works. But we only have a half response, and we need a whole response. Yes, we need personal responsibility, and I am grateful to every member of this congregation and community who has taken seriously the recommendations and is following them. But it is abundantly evident that we also need a unified, community, national approach. And I ask you to call, to advocate, to speak with your friends and family members, with your neighbors, with our governor, with our president, with everyone you can think of, to tell them we must care for one another. The example of our leaders, the nurses and doctors who are leading us, the example of those who are risking their lives to care for us, speaks the truth that we need. Every single life matters, none more than any other. We must care for one another. Speak the truth. Do not stop.
We are a gentle, angry people.
This reading, the moral law, is from the book The Prophets by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Why were so few voices raised in the ancient world in protest against the ruthlessness of rulers? Why are human beings so obsequious, ready to kill and ready to die at the call of kings and chieftains? Perhaps it is because they worship might, venerate those who command might, and are convinced that it is by force that people prevail. The splendor and the pride of kings blind the people. But the prophets of Israel repudiated the work as well as the power of mortals as an object of supreme adoration. They denounced arrogant boasting and haughty pride. The kings who ruled the nations in anger, the oppressors, the destroyers of nations who went forth to inflict waste, ruin, and death, the guilty men whose own might is their God. The end of arrogant power is to realize the moral law. Power exalts itself and is incapable of yielding to any transcendent judgment. It listens to no voice. It is the bitter irony of history that the common people, who are devoid of power and are the prospective victims of its abuse, are the first to become the ally of him who accumulates power. Power is spectacular, while its end, the moral law, is inconspicuous.
Every single life is of equal value. Your life is as valuable as mine. We must care for one another with personal responsibility and with a cooperative, unified, coordinated effort. The value of every life calls out for this. Speak the truth without ceasing.
We have spent